Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to welcome you all and thank you for joining in on our webinar today. We have a speaker, Trinity Senda-Ndlovu, who will be presenting on modeling the impacts of climate change on livestock productivity and rangeland productivity and livestock production dynamics. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Nozipho Ndlovu. I am the Livestock Project Officer at Solidaridad, and a big part of my job is to work very closely with the Southern Africa Regional Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and support the Secretariat. We have representatives from the roundtable today with us, and they will speak briefly and tell us more about the work they do. Our main speaker today is Trinity Senda. As I've said, Trinity is a researcher. She is busy completing her PhD in agrosystems management with the University of Nairobi in Kenya. She's an avid researcher and is not new in the area of research. Trinity has spent a lot of time at the Matopos Research Station as a research officer. But before we get to hear from Trinity, I'd just like to give a chance to representatives from the roundtable. Max and Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, I was in the process of saying that I was the chairman of Southern Africa Regional Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And my role this afternoon is simply to welcome everybody, all the participants to the webinar, and wish us a fruitful meeting. But very quickly, the Southern Africa Regional Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is a grouping of Southern African member states, including Swaziland, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, which has chosen to endorse the principles, vision, and mission of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, whose vision is a world in which all aspects of the beef value chain are environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable. Today's webinar is not only appropriate, but critical for our cause. Therefore, we at the Southern Africa Regional Roundtable Sustainable Beef are excited to be part of this webinar. With these few remarks, let me hand over to my colleague, Max Makuvise from Zimbabwe, to provide more details on Southern Africa Regional Sustainable Beef and our relationship with the Global Roundtable. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, everybody should be able to see my screen now. Right, guys, our Chairman, Patrick, gave a brief introduction, but I'd just like to go do a bit more. You can follow us on bottom left corner at SARRS Beef. That's on Twitter. That's our Twitter handle, which we'll be using a lot more of. Basically, we are a member of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is, for want of a better expression, our mother body. And the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is a global multi-stakeholder initiative developed to advance continuous improvement in sustainability of the global beef value chain through leadership, science, and multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration. The GRSB envisions a world in which all aspects of the beef value chain are environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable. Bottom left corner is their website. This information, well, this particular slide was drawn directly from their website, so I didn't invent this wording. The core principles of sustainable beef revolve around natural resources, people in the community, animal health, food, efficiency, and innovation. And our job of the SARRSB is to follow the values as set by the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Our members, as Patrick has mentioned before, and I've gone from north to south so that there can be no accusations of favoritism with regard to countries. Patrick at the top, our chairman, Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. The reason we our members and why we feel we need to help with the improvement in sub-Saharan Africa of livestock is there are certain barriers to sustainability that we have, and we as a roundtable need to overcome. First one being natural resources, where grazing land is overstocked. We have bushfires, and farmers unfortunately rely too heavily on rainfall and don't have methods of harvesting water. We're talking specifically about smallholder farmers, as in farmers in the rural areas where the majority of the cattle on the continent are based. The next one is people and the community. Smallholder farmers have limited access to information, pricing, standards, customer segments, location of facilities, disease outbreaks, new medicines. And also what we're finding is consumers are demanding a lot more from the products that they use. They want to know where their beef has come from, how it was managed, etc., etc. And a lot of pressure is being put onto the small farmer. So without adequate information, it's impossible for them to meet those needs. Moving on to animal health and well-being. The first and biggest one is the breeding practices. Animals are just breeding, and we're getting a lot of inbreeding and animals genetically going backwards. We have poor animal husbandry and lack of herd management, very little or limited access to supplementary feeds, vaccinations, and extension officers. In Zimbabwe, we used to have a very good extension service, but it's very tough at the moment. We also have problems with disease control for tick-borne diseases, and diseases that are contagious. Efficiency and innovation. Not enough information is reaching the smallholder farmer in this digital age, and there are various reasons for that. Some of which are data is expensive, and the other one is that most apps that you find in this day and age are geared towards crops as opposed to livestock. Our extension services also are not moving with the times and adopting new, efficient and innovative ways of teaching our small-scale farmers. There's also a bit of a disconnect between the government, the private sector, and the donor community. What we mean by this is you have government, private sector, and donor community, and all three are not talking together at the same time. You'll have the private sector talking to government, donors talking to government, donors talking to private sector, but not all at once in a cohesive manner. So what is the solution? As SARSB, we have three areas which we can help. The first one is advocacy. One thing we suffer from, I would say suffer from, but which distinguishes us from the rest of the GRSB constituents is that we have no commonality, in that in America, they have their own roundtable. In Brazil, they have their own roundtable. Europe is similar to us in which they have a European roundtable, but they have the EU. So they have common laws which go across European nation states. We're 7 nations who all have different laws and different methods of governance. We are all members of SADC, but as yet, I don't think there are any common laws with regard to animals. So part of our job is advocacy. Second part of our job is projects, specific projects, doing things where, for example, implementing a project in Zambia on cattle that then can be replicated and scaled throughout the region. And the third one is global participation. This is one of the most important ones. We sitting here in Africa, we know our livestock, we know how we've herded them for years and years. What we don't want to be doing is reinventing the wheel. There are some technological advances, animal health advances that have taken place in other countries. What we're saying is we need to, through our parent organization, be able to share that, to be able to learn and to adapt to the changing climate situation. I'm thanking you in advance for your support because I'm sure it's going to be coming. And I've put my own contact details at the bottom of the slide. Nozip, I'll hand it back over to you, and I've sent you a copy of the slides today, so if you want to share it or send it out to other participants, feel free to do so.
Thank you, Max, for such a clear introduction of the roundtable. I just want to encourage everyone to please feel free to engage with us on the question and answer chat box with your questions so that we can get back to you. I think we can hand over to Trinity. Hi, Trinity, thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you can see my screen. Okay, good afternoon once again, and thank you for the introduction, Nozipo. And thank you to Solidaridad for the invitation to make this presentation. I'm going to give insights from the research article which we recently published with my co-authors. I hope they are online. We've got Professor Gregory Kaika from the University of Florida, Dr. Patricia Mascati from ICRAF Zambia, Albert Chirima from the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe, and Dr. Johan van Niekerk from the University of the Free State. And myself, I am currently with the University of Nairobi as a PhD student at the final stages of the PhD, writing up as we speak. So as a way of introduction, livestock is very important in the livelihoods of smallholder farmers in semi-arid areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And feed remains the most important limiting factor. And while on that, the rangelands are the main source of feed for livestock in these areas, but feed availability is dependent on the rangeland quality varies with time, and it also varies with space. So you find that there are times when you've got a lot of feed in good quality, and then there are times when you don't have feed in good quality and don't have enough quantity. And this is dependent on a number of ecological conditions such as rainfall and temperature, which is why for us it was important to understand the implications of climate variables on rangeland productivity and livestock population dynamics. So if we look at climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find that according to the IPCC projections, there is a temperature projection of between 1.5 to 3.1 temperature increase by 2050. And temperature increase is not too good for forage digestibility because it tends to increase lignification, thereby reducing the quality of the feed. And then in terms of the rainfall predictions for sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of variability. Some areas are predicted to be drier in 2050, or some are predicted to be wetter. So there's a lot of instability at the moment with the climate models for rainfall prediction. And then another important variable for rangelands is carbon dioxide, and it is expected to increase by 57% in 2050. So it's another variable which we tried to look at its implications on rangeland productivity. And if we can quickly look at the distribution of livestock production systems in the world, you would find that we have for semi-arid areas, we have quite a lot of rangeland-based systems in terms of livestock production. And as you can see, I had Max talking about the SADC region, and the SADC region, the most part of SADC region falls in the semi-arid to arid areas, and livestock production in those systems is rangeland-based. So rangelands are very important as a livestock feed in these areas. So what we sought to understand was, we realized there is limited information on the extent of climate change impacts on rangelands in these areas, both spatially and temporally. Yet farmers need information on how the feed base will change and to what extent that would affect livestock production so that they make informed production decisions. So the purpose of this simulation basically was to get an indication of the magnitude and direction of change in rangeland productivity, so as to guide programming by whoever is doing programming, planning by farmers, and decision making from a policy level. So the objectives of this particular research was to assess the impacts of changing rainfall and temperature on biomass yields and livestock population dynamics in space and time, and also to assess the influence of elevated CO2 levels on rangeland productivity. So we created some different climate scenarios. These scenarios were actually based on the GCM predictions for this region, Southern Africa. So like I said, there are scenarios where we'll have hot and wet conditions or hot and dry conditions. And all this was based on the historic scenario where we're saying if current climatic conditions prevail, what kind of rangeland productivity are we likely to get? And we ran a 30-year simulation. And the other thing is we ran these scenarios with or without increased carbon dioxide. the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are around 400 parts per million. So we had a scenario where we said, what if we remain with 400 parts per million, or what if carbon dioxide increases to 650 parts per million? So this particular study, we used Ngai district in Zimbabwe as our study site. It has fairly unreliable rainfall, and which ranges between 450 to 650 millimeters per annum. And the human population density varies from anything between 5 to 50 persons per square kilometer. And the soils are also quite variable. We've got 2 major soil types, the sandy loams and the red soils, which are very critical in determining the rangeland type we have in that area. So in terms of the methodology, we used the Savannah ecosystem modeling approach, which was developed by Michael Kovner in 1993 with the aim of representing ecosystem dynamics at a landscape scale. This model is spatially explicit, meaning this basically means that we can look at things on a spatial scale, and it's grid-based and it's process-oriented. It's driven by processes that take place in the ecosystem. So what it does is that it computes plant production and forage intake by animals using a weekly time step. So we get outputs of what biomass we get for the different vegetation layers on a weekly basis. So you can then convert that to monthly basis or annual basis, which is what we did when we're now doing the analysis. And the other interesting thing is that we can see how much is available for the animals and how much is being taken by the animals. And the other thing is this model also simulates the spatial redistribution of herbivores in response to changes in vegetation quantity and quality using the Habitat Suitability Index. So the other thing about this model, why we decided to go with the Savannah model, is that it's not a global scale model, but it's a mesoscale, excuse me, it's a mesoscale forecast model. And the advantages of that are that we can then carry out localized impacts assessments and then come up with localized mitigation alternatives, which will be meaningful to local level stakeholders. So in terms of the parameterization for this model, it uses a lot of parameters. And one of the good things about Ngai district is that we had quite a huge number of parameters readily available. So it was not so difficult to get the parameterization in good shape. It uses rainfall, it's driven by rainfall, by temperature, by soils. And then we developed our own water maps using the borehole points that we had that were georeferenced already, and also the rivers and the dams in that area. And then we also used the livestock and the vegetation physiological parameters that were developed and applied on some research in Kruger National Park. And this model also is driven by the elevation. So we needed to get the digital elevation model for Ngai and the slope. And then we also needed to use the initial livestock population to run the simulation. And then for the vegetation, we had to place the plants into 6 functional groups. And the livestock, we also worked with 4 livestock functional groups, which is basically cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. And maybe a little bit more about the spatial structure of the model. Like I said, it's grid-based. We need to overlay the soils with the topography and the vegetation for each layer, for each grid. This has to be defined. And for each grid, we need to understand that we have. So we're working with the woody patch, the herbaceous patch, and the shrub patches. So the model will then simulate the production of the vegetation based on those layers. We'll get outputs for the herbaceous layer, the shrub layer, and the woody layer. For the herbaceous layer, that's basically the grasses and the forbs. And then for the results, we found that in the base simulations, there was a significant increase in the shrub layer over the 30-year period, from something as low as 300 grams per square meter to around 1,200 grams per square meter. For us, we really had confidence in this result because we were looking at even the patterns that we are observing right now on the ground. We are seeing a huge increase in shrubs. We're seeing a huge increase in the bush encroachment. So that gave us confidence that this model, at least it's simulating patterns that are on the ground. And then we also saw a huge increase, a threefold increase in the woody component. And then the herbaceous layer, there wasn't much increase over the 30-year simulation, but it was fluctuating around the rainfall quantities for the different years. And another, if we look at 1992 and 2002, we all know that we had a huge drought in the region, and our model also managed to simulate this pattern because we saw a decline in the biomass production for all the three layers around this time. Maybe to show you some maps. What you see on the left panel is the spatial distribution for the shrub layer. We picked the 4th month of, we picked March of every year, which is more or less the peak production around Nkai. And we picked every 4th year. Like I said, we get results on a weekly time step. So it means at any given time in a year, we get 52 of these maps. So I couldn't present all. So I just picked a map from March every 4th year. As you can see then, if we look at 1980, where I've just put a circle there, there wasn't so much bush encroachment at that time. And if we look at March 2004, it's more green around March, meaning to say we now have a lot of bush encroachment. And on the right, that's basically the grass. Like I said, it follows rainfall and production for that year. And I mentioned the 1992 drought, it's looking all red. There was basically no grass because the drought of 1992 was huge. But in 2000, we had a good season. And as you can see, there were a lot of green on the northern parts of the district. And then in terms of the historical scenario, which is the baseline scenario for the livestock population dynamics, we see that if you look at all the livestock, maybe if I can pick the cattle, it was increasing slightly until around the mid-90s. Basically, that's for all the livestock types. They were all increasing until around the drought for 1990, which brought everything down. And maybe if you can pick one species, the sheep there, they've always been low. And the 1992, 2000 drought, thereabout, it completely wiped everything off, which may be interesting to explore in a discussion. And for us, again, this result was interesting because there aren't so many sheep in Nkai. So we feel that this model is really doing good in simulating local conditions. And then in terms of the spatial distribution of the livestock, again, for selected years, I put for what we see at the top there, it's the, let me move the controls a bit. It's the cattle, and then the goats is the second row, and then the third row is the donkeys. So what we see there for the goats, in the 1980s, there weren't so many goats, but we begin to see a lot of goats in the northern parts of that district with time. And again, it's another pattern which the model simulated quite well. But again, this may be very much influenced by the initial livestock populations that we used. So it's a matter of continued discussion, really. But then if we look at the biomass, this is the simulated biomass with the climate change scenario. So again, this is for the grass. So I need to move the controls. Okay. So for the simulated grass biomass, we see that it's changing similar in almost all the climate scenarios, except of course for the peak and low years, which we've mentioned 1992 and 2002, for example. And again, these dynamics are similar until about 2003, when we begin to see the elevated carbon dioxide effects. And again, we wouldn't want to say that the grass was decreasing because of the increase in carbon dioxide, but we would like to believe that this increase was due to an increase in the woody component, which was creating the shade effect. The grass layer generally seems less responsive to the CO2 levels. As you can see there, like around 2000 to 2002, it's basically the grass was going down, and this is for the scenarios where we had an increase, where we're using 650 parts per million for carbon dioxide for both wet and dry scenarios, hot and wet, and hot and dry scenarios. And then for the shrubs, like I mentioned, that we see a huge increase in the shrubs for all the climate change scenarios, be it with carbon dioxide, without carbon dioxide. And we're seeing quite a systematic increase in the shrub biomass. And the shrub biomass are somewhat influenced by CO2 levels, but we see temperature and rainfall featuring a little bit more. As you can see, where I've put that circle, it's a scenario where we have an increase in CO2 and a decrease in rainfall. So there's more variation really in the second half of the simulation, but overall, there's a huge increase in the shrubs in Kai during the simulation. And then for the woody layer, which is basically the trees, we see that the biomass levels significantly affected by gains in elevated CO2. And this is because they are using the C3 photosynthetic pathway, which is sensitive to elevated CO2. And interestingly, the three lower layers of the wood biomass, what we see there, are all the scenarios without increased carbon dioxide. And the three upper layers is scenarios with increased carbon dioxide. So this clearly shows that carbon dioxide is very important for the increase in the woody layer. So there's so much sensitivity of the woody layer to increase CO2. It's even more important than changes in rainfall and temperature. So a little bit of discussion, we see that tree biomass can increase or decrease depending on the prevailing conditions. It can increase in such a way that it can suppress grass growth, or there can be an open woodland allowing for grass growth. So basically the balance between the woody and the herbaceous component is important for influencing herbivory, and an increase in the woody component is a major concern for livestock farmers. Take note. An increase in the woody has an effect of reducing grazing capacity, for example, for those livestock species which are not able to utilize the woody component, especially for when trees begin to grow beyond the 1.2 meter height. And again, an increased shrub biomass across all climatic scenarios, it means there's need to reconsider management options, range of management options in that area. And I've put there in red that we probably need some additional sensitivity analysis to really explore these effects further. This paper, it actually takes care of an initial simulation to give us an indication of the direction and a magnitude of change in rangeland processes under climatic conditions. It's really not a final one. A lot can be. And take note of this one. This was a surprising result for us because we realized there's a relative insensitivity of livestock to various climatic scenarios. But take note, this is livestock effects via rangeland. It's not direct climate change impacts on the livestock productivity. This is via rangeland processes. One may misunderstand that and think we're saying livestock is not sensitive to climate change. We're not saying that, but we're saying from this simulation, when we look at climate change impacts through rangeland productivity, we're seeing a relative insensitivity. And again, this is worth exploring further. Maybe in conclusion, and also some key messages, herbivore vegetation interactions can be quite complex. So we feel we did a good job in this study because this is quite complex. And an increase in the shrubby layer it means there's a looming bush encroachment in the horizon. So there's need to really consider management of rangeland management options, serious need for bush encroachment management practices. And in Kai, we saw that forests really are not a critical feed source for cattle. This is because mostly forests are dominated by trees, which are beyond the reach for the feeding height for cattle. And then because of the shade effect, there's not much grass production. Like I've said, from this initial simulation, climate change effects may not have strong effects on rangeland near century, like around 2050, because we ran a 30-year simulation. But take note, if we consider how much degradation is already going on in semi-arid areas, it means the vulnerability is high. So there's need really to do something before we even talk about maybe looking at how to reduce the impacts of climate change on the rangelands. There is need to already make sure that we improve the productivity of the rangelands right now, and make sure we reclaim the degraded rangelands, because if we combine that with climate change impacts, the effects may be quite devastating. And if carbon dioxide levels continue to increase, the wood layer may respond much more strongly than other layers, as we've already seen. And as such, there may be a need to advise farmers to invest in keeping a mix of livestock, not just maybe specializing on cattle only or on goats only. If you remember, I mentioned that the drought of 1992, from our simulation, it shows that it wiped all the sheep. Imagine if there was a farmer who was dependent on sheep. So what we encourage as a way of maybe adapting to climate change is that farmers keep a mixed different species of livestock on their farms. And maybe for more information, if you want to read more, this is the paper, it's open access, and that is the link there. I've shared the slides with Nozipo. I hope they will be made available to you. And we would like to appreciate the ACME project for funding this work. And this work was also part funded by USAID through the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And take note, the opinions, findings, and conclusions that we are talking about in this paper are our opinions, not necessarily of those of the funders, are our findings, not in any way influenced by the funders. And also grateful for financial support from ACME, USAID, and ICRISAT, and we're grateful to Dr. Michael Kofiner for providing the livestock parameters, and as well as giving detailed savanna insights. And we're grateful again to ICRISAT, the GIS lab, for providing this spatial information. Thanks to Matopos Research for availing the time for me to do this work, because I was with them at the time I did this work. And I also want to thank Solidaridad team for making this webinar possible. Before I go, let me share a little bit more about the work that I'm currently doing on modeling pastoral systems. So for Nkai, what we did, we just looked at the implications of climate change on the rangeland, but we didn't link it to the humans that are actually surviving from the livestock that feed on that rangeland. So what we are doing in Nkai, we are actually looking at the implications of land tenure change induced grazing alterations on the rangeland and also on the pastoralist well-being. We are now, instead of just using the savanna model, we are now using the savanna model combined with an agent-based household model, Dekuma. So we're taking the coupled human and natural systems modeling approach. I'd be happy to share this once we have some interesting results, which I'm pretty sure they'll be interesting. And if you want to get in touch with me for more engagement, collaboration, networking questions, please feel free to contact me on any of those contact channels. You can telephone me, WhatsApp, email, and you can check my LinkedIn, or we can talk on Skype. Thank you. I hand over to Nozipo to coordinate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Trinity, for such a insightful presentation. That was very clear and interesting. From our end, on our livestock project here in Zambia, I see a lot of information that we can use for decision making in our probably project implementation. There's just a lot of insights and information that we can build on. And I foresee a lot of follow-up questions, but in the interest of time, I think looking at the questions we have, I'll try and put together the questions into two in the interest of time. So Trinity, if you could probably respond to this first question. So the first question is asking about, at local level, what can small-scale farmers do to probably mitigate against the impacts of climate change on their rangeland? What do you see as possible for the small-scale farmer to do at local level?
Okay, thank you, Nazipo, for the question. So, like I already mentioned that the rangelands are already in a poor state. So there's need to work on improving the rangelands now so that we mitigate the climate change impacts. We do not want the climate change impacts to hit the farmers when the rangelands are already in a terrible state. So what I would advise is that they engage in rangeland management practices that will improve the productivity of the rangeland. There's a lot of them. There are so many things that they can do really to improve their rangelands. They can start by reclaiming the rangelands and many other management interventions that they can do to improve their rangelands and do whatever it takes to reduce degradation. At least we need to somehow halt the degradation that is going on in the rangelands of semi-arid areas.
Thank you, Trinity. That's very clear. There's a second question from Enoch. Enoch is asking if you could maybe talk further. They are looking at working on the rangeland along the Kafue Flats here in Zambia. Enoch is asking if you could share information or you work with them to untangle the complexities that are there, to help the Kafue Flats, the rangeland degradation that is going on there.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot that can be done. Like I said, I think the first step is to do a thorough rangeland condition assessment so that then they know what needs to be done. I can also, through maybe the chat box, share. I have a report that I wrote on the rangeland condition assessment for the Borana in Ethiopia. So I think rangeland condition assessment is actually the first important step. Then they can see the damage that is there. They can see what needs to be done and what can be done, because we can't just say this is what needs to be done, but we need to first understand how much the damage, what is the condition like, so that we can then recommend what can work for that area.
Okay, I just think it would be very interesting to put you in touch with the guys, with Enoch and his colleagues to probably talk in detail about this.
Yes, sure, that's my pleasure.
So do you think we can take more questions? One or two?
Hi, Nozipo. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A box from Nicholas Nyati, Stephen Shiweshe, and Damika Carr. Would Trinity maybe attend to those? Maybe you can read them out to her.
Okay. So Trinity, there's a question from Nicholas. Nicholas is asking about the real impact of climate change on rangelands and consequences on livestock numbers, and what smallholder farmers should do to mitigate such effects.
Okay, like the real impact from this study, what we're seeing in terms of the real impact of climate change on rangelands, it's been quite evident in terms of the woody component, as we saw an increase in the trees and also in the shrubs. That is in the long run. So what I would suggest, like I already said, maybe for an increase in bush encroachment, I would personally suggest that maybe we get to implement rangeland management practices that will stop this bush encroachment. Or as a goat person in my other world, I've been doing goats, I would recommend that people keep more goats. They're quite efficient in helping to reduce bush encroachment. So it's basically about taking care of the rangeland now so that we mitigate against the climate change impacts in the future. The second part of the question was saying?
So the second part of the question was saying, what smallholder farmers should do to mitigate such effects?
Well, I think that's already answered, right? To say that
Yeah, I
we
think
need to
it
take
is.
care of the rangelands now. And again, the other problem with rangeland management in our areas is that these rangelands are communally owned. So it may be difficult to really have a common consensus to say, let's do it, and they do something productive. So it just takes a very strong community leadership to do things that are actually productive. I've seen in some areas, there's been work which has been done through maybe support from NGOs to say, let's do some rangeland reclamation on this piece of land. So the motivation from the locals is usually that there's someone supporting them. But I would like to believe if this can be, if they can get an understanding that this is their life, it's their one in it, and mobilize themselves even without external help, I feel it can help them.
It can work. Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll quickly go over to Stephen Chiweshe's question. So Stephen says his question is if the simulation assessed the effects of population, that is human growth, for example, with the clear increase in goats over the decade shown, can that be attributed to number of household increases?
Well, that is possible. That is possible, really. So what we did for our simulation for the livestock bid, we had two scenarios. We tried to simulate a constant livestock population, and then we also simulated a fluctuating livestock situation to say what happens when the livestock numbers increase. So we found that the pattern was pretty much the same. But like I mentioned, that for the work that we are doing in Ethiopia now, we are actually even taking care of, we're putting a very strong human population, component, so that we really understand how these dynamics unfold. So, but for Nkai, we did not really look at the increase in human population, but we did try to fluctuate the livestock numbers to say what happens when the livestock numbers increase. But like we're saying, they may be increasing because people are keeping more and they're buying in more, not necessarily that it's an internal thing within Nkai.
Yeah, that's clear. So the next question is from Damika Ka. He's asking if it would not be interesting, to compare, to do the modeling comparing more recent data?
Says what? Okay, why we okay, it says why did you use very old data for modeling?
Yeah.
For modeling, we need to have a historic scenario. So we used the 1980 to 2010 rainfall weather data as our historic scenario. And what we were trying to do, we're trying to simulate the conditions of that 30-year period. We are not predicting the future. We are trying to give the direction and magnitude of change. The goal was not really to give maybe a prediction, but then for recent data, again, we can try to use recent data, maybe say for the past 10 years, and we'll still be using it as the historic scenario in this case. But for the climate change, what would have been more interesting maybe, or what we can still explore, is to use climate data which is being projected into the future, because we created our own climate scenarios based on the GCMs. But now that we have rainfall, we have temperature which is being predicted for the future, we can probably run some more simulations using future climate, not the historic climate.
Okay. Yeah, so the next question is from Michael Dawes. He says he's working in Kai communities. What activities practically can a development organization promote? Rangeland management seems impossible to achieve in a communal farming setup. Are we clear?
Well, I'm not sure if that is a question directed to me alone. I think it's a question really that we all need to ask ourselves, what can people do in Kai? I've already given my recommendations to say there's a need to do rangeland management practices, but maybe if it's difficult to implement these things, we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong, or what can we do differently? Maybe not necessarily as a response from this study, but something that we all need to ask ourselves. And yeah.
Okay, yeah, actually I agree, because even on this question, there's a lot of lessons to learn from our pilot that we're actually doing here in Mazabuka in Zambia. So we could follow up with more conversation, follow up on more questions to share. And so the next question says, what is your view of high intensity, short duration grazing as a measure for improving rangeland condition? That's from Barbara.
Well, I think it's something I need to think about. There's been a lot of work that has been done in terms of grazing management. Some are for that high intensity, some are for rotational grazing, some are for holistic management. Really, I think it really needs, I wouldn't like say I go for this one, but I think there's a whole lot of different ideas about it. It's something that I have not really thought through, and I don't have the answer at the tip of my finger right now.
Okay, so I'll quickly rush to the next question. It says, bush encroachment is one of the serious problems on rangelands in some parts of dry areas of Zimbabwe. Is this a climate change issue? Has your model simulated livestock response in feeding habits in relation to changes on the rangelands due to climate change or other factors? If yes, what has been the outcome?
Okay, I agree that bush encroachment is a serious issue on the dry parts of Zimbabwe. And it's not only Zimbabwe, by the way, even on where we're working in Ethiopia now, there's serious bush encroachment. I wouldn't want to say it's a climate change issue. There are so many issues that that can drive bush encroachment. Land use change is one of them. Population increase, when people settle, maybe in some, like what is happening in Ethiopia, there are settlements in areas which were not originally meant to be settled. They do a little bit of farming and leave that place. And we know what happens then, the bushes start to grow, and really there's a lot of other issues. And the other problem that we are beginning to see in the rangelands of semi-arid areas is not only bush encroachment, there's also an increase in other invasive species. So there are so many issues with rangelands in semi-arid areas which need to be tackled. And it says, has your model simulated livestock in response to feeding habits in relation to changes? Well, we did not simulate feeding habits, but what we did when we were parameterizing the model was that the livestock that we worked with, we parameterized them in such a way that we take care of their feeding habits. Like we parameterized goats as browsers, and we parameterized cattle and sheep as grazers.
Okay, we can go on. So there's a question from a visitor. He's asking, what can the ecosystem of hectares that is up and down the value chain do to support smallholder farmers who have limited capacity to respond to climatic changes? What key interventions in rangeland management?
Well, I wouldn't, this is not a response that is coming from my study, but maybe from my personal experience as a researcher. I would say there's need for combined efforts. There's need for a thorough understanding of the state of the rangelands, and there's need to come up with tailor-made interventions for different areas. It's not a one-size-fits-all, really. There's need for rangeland condition assessment by whoever is working with smallholder farmers, so that they come up with relevant interventions for that particular area. But like he's saying, that an ecosystem of hectares, it means there's need for combined efforts and understanding who can do what and where.
Yeah, very clear. What should policy do in terms of matching livestock productivity and environment sustainability under the climate action paradigm? This is from GVS.
Well, I don't know really. There's a lot that policy can do. I think our role as researchers is to give them such kind of research to say, this is the magnitude and direction of change. Things may look like this. So position yourselves in accordingly in terms of policy formulation. So in terms of what exactly they should do, I mean, I wouldn't exactly know.
Be able to answer that. Okay, I'll quickly go to the next one. We are promoting the production of bushmeal from indigenous tree species, including encroaching bush. The approach is reportedly successful in other countries such as Namibia. I guess this is a comment. Thank you, Michael. Then Cloud Hessen says, the major problem is breaking tradition. Too many livestock that equals overgrazing, and poor livestock husbandry in general provides chronic diseases and poor quality animals. How do we address this?
Well, again, I'm not sure if that response should come from me.
Yeah, no, okay. I have been dealing with illegal grazing today and had to involve the police, so I was unable to get to the first part. Okay, that's fine, sorry. Regarding assessment of livestock feed from trees, did you consider edible pods?
Oh yes, we did consider the pods. Actually, most of when we're parameterizing the woody part, we actually had the acacias parameterized separately.
Okay, the last question is, were findings communicated to the communities in Gai? Were findings communicated to the communities in Gai?
I was part of a big project, the ACME project, that was continuously doing work in Kai and giving feedback. But this particular paper has, was published recently. Hopefully we can then try to package it in a way that farmers can consume. In its current state, it's very scientific, but it would be nice to maybe package it in a way that farmers can understand and appreciate and relate with.
Okay, yeah, so that was our last question. Or there's one more from Mike. Is most if not all communal rangelands are at non-equilibrium state. Is there any possibility in the near future that these rangelands can revert back to equilibrium state as a result of high livestock deaths due to starvation triggered by climate change? Did you get that?
Yeah, I get it. The issue of rangelands being on equilibrium or non-equilibrium is actually quite debatable. There's a lot of debate around that. But what I can say now is that there seems to be equilibrium when there is rainfall coefficient of variation is over 40%. So this is quite debatable, and I think it's nice. It would be nice to explore it in other studies.
Thank you so much, Trinity, for your time and such an engaging presentation. I think at this point, I would just like to hand over to Mr. Mandla Ngomo, the regional managing director for Southern Africa region at Solidaridad, to give the closing remarks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nozipho. I would like to also extend my sincere thanks to Max and Patrick from the Southern Africa Region Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, but also most importantly to our researcher, Trinity, who we have temporarily loaned to East Africa for doing some awesome research, which I think is showing what really needs to happen, which is we have great scientists who are doing fantastic research. That research needs to be shared with an audience like what we have today. So I also want to thank all of you who've taken time to be part of this presentation and webinar to engage with scientific researchers. And with research, we are not asking any of us to completely agree with anything that Trinity has said, but we are asking all of us to take note of what the research findings are, and hopefully to make some changes where appropriate in how we are implementing development work across the region. I think what is important for us as Solidaridad is that we believe in creating sustainable supply chains and inclusive supply chains. Part of the sustainability conversation does talk about ecological sustainability, does talk about social sustainability, and also talks about economic sustainability. And I think this research points to a cross-section between the environmental, the social, and ultimately the economic. Because if the rangelands have the drastic changes that they will have, we need to be asking the question, what can we do now in order to prevent adverse changes? What livestock practices should we be adapting in places like Ngai to make sure that we've got improved livelihoods for the communities that are there? And for us as Solidaridad, we think that that conversation is incomplete if we are also not looking at the impact or the potential impact from an economic point of view in those communities. Because most of the rural areas where most of us work have got, rural people who run livestock as one of their livelihood activities. And if they're not able to participate in markets because their livestock is decimated by droughts, because there's not proper husbandry, etc., at the end of the day, the poverty situation in those areas continues from one generation to the next. But our belief is that if we combine our resources, our knowledge, and our experience, and come together to support, we can create a new trajectory which we think can change livestock and livestock farming in Southern Africa, which is why we support the Southern Africa Roundtable for sustainable beef, because we believe that it is in convening multiple stakeholders, including researchers, we can start a different conversation and move the livestock sector in our region in a different trajectory. I do really want to thank you, and as Nozipo has already shared, we will be sharing copies of this recording, but also the slides that were shared today by Trinity will be available for all participants. We hope that this is the first of many dialogues and conversations that we can all have as people who love the livestock sector and want to see it grow and to improve. So I thank you so much for your participation. We're really honored to have had you on this webinar. Thank you. Over to you, Nozipo.
Thank you, Mandla. I just want to thank everyone who joined in today. We really appreciated your time. And what was of interest to me was the engagement by show of the questions that came through to us. And I'd just like to invite everyone to follow up, write to us. I think our contact details were shared. We'd just like to hear from you and engage with as many stakeholders as possible in the region. Thank you.